the Danes, by the Poles, by the countries which will not let the European Union separate itself from NATO. On the contrary, they will push it further deeper into NATO's nets. When you have the head of diplomacy of a country or an organization, and here Josep Borrell is head of diplomacy at the European Union, that a conflict can only be solved through military means. It must be an emotional outburst of his, or maybe he's misstating his position, or maybe he's just speaking outside of his mandate. In any case, this is an extraordinary occurrence, and we will speak about this officially. We will issue the relevant documents as a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You also mentioned Frank-Walter Steinmeier. I've known him very well as a Minister of Foreign Affairs, now he's President of Germany. In a recent interview, he was asked whether Russian leadership, such as the President and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, should be put to trial. He effectively answered in the affirmative. He said that everyone responsible for the military operation and political decisions should be held responsible. I leave that to his conscience, of course. I hope that facts will prevail in Germany, and that who is to blame for war crimes will not be decided on the basis of fake news, such as the cases of Bucha and Kramatorsk, but actual facts uncovered by our military in the course of our operation, and evidence by real people who have lived in the divided Donbass, separated from their families, and who had lived under this yoke, suffering from these Nazis. And the hardships that they describe boggle the mind. The hardships they have suffered under the control of those so-called territorial defense battalions and Nazi battalions. Steinmeier also said an interesting thing about Ukraine. He said that as a diplomat, he never devoted so much time as to Ukraine. In 2007, he was the one who initiated the drafting of an accession agreement for Ukraine. And when the Maidan started, he was the one who initiated talks between Yanukovych and the opposition. And this is indeed true. But, a half-truth is worse than a lie. He actually omitted several important episodes and decisive moments in those events. First of all, the association agreement between the Ukraine and the European Union implied zero tariffs on most goods. But when the agreement was mature in 2013, we reminded our Ukrainian colleagues that we have a free trade agreement with them as part of the CIS framework. And we have serious protection with regard to European goods as part of WTO. So if they have zero tariffs with Europe, and we have zero tariffs with Ukraine, we will have goods from the European Union flowing to our country in breach of the agreements we have with the WTO. So we warn them that we need to solve this so that we do not suffer as a result of this. As Steinmeier said, he initiated these association talks, but what we heard from our Ukrainian colleagues that we had no business in this regard, and that this would be solved beside us. we would be forced to create a barrier on the border with Ukraine. And then, when we voiced our concerns in this form, they had to postpone the talks so that our interests are taken into account. And after all of this, the Europe that Frank-Walter Steinmeier is so proud of, this Europe provoked the Maidan. They sent people into the streets under the pretext of ousting Yanukovych, who wouldn't let Ukraine become part of the EU. And Steinmeier said he was not only the initiator of the talks between the opposition and Yanukovych, but he was also the one who initiated the finalization of those talks with the settlement agreement. And he also put his signature together with the representatives of Poland and France as a guarantor of this agreement. But the next morning, this agreement was annulled, and from the very first day, the opposition cancelled the special status of the Russian language, despite the fact that it was enshrined in the constitution. And they said that Russians should get out of Crimea. They sent trains with bandits, with armed bandits. And after that, the eastern regions of Ukraine declined to recognize this coup d'etat, and then they were declared terrorists, and the so-called anti-terrorist operation was commenced. So Frank-Walter Steinmeier also forgot to mention that France, Germany, and the European Union proved helpless. And they even showed a lack of self-respect because their signatures were finally worth nothing. And they even encouraged this behavior when they saw that these bandits who got into power would be obedient to Western manipulations. And when dozens of innocent civilians died in the House of Trade Unions, and when Ukrainian army planes bombed the center of Lugansk, we saw the tragedies that arose as a result of that. And after that, they have declined to call it a coup d'etat. They said it was just something you have when you have democracy. So these are the costs of democracy. Can you imagine that? And in February 2015, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, along with the leaders of the Normandy format, he was one of the people who drafted the Minsk Accords, which were shelved right after they were signed. Poroshenko and his team declined to implement those agreements. They spoke in the Ukrainian parliament saying they would not act on those agreements, that those are just political declarations. And then we had that approved at Security Council level, so it became part of international law. But they still ignored those commitments, and the Ukrainian regime was encouraged to sabotage its commitments further on as well. But we continued to look for compromise. We were even willing to make additional concessions. We were willing to act as mediators with the People's Republics, which Kiev declined to engage in dialogue with directly. And eventually we had the so-called Steinmeier formula. So when we discussed the sequence of actions which should be done first, he suggested the so-called Steinmeier formula. After this formula was adopted and everyone welcomed that formula, it also became ineffective. And Poroshenko and then Zelensky, who took his place, systematically refused to implement this formula. And so, this was the second time that Steinmeier was put to shame diplomatically. Because as a person who calls himself the initiator of many things to do with Ukrainian society's development, didn't provide much results. As regards the provocations in Bucha and Kramatorsk, what can you say? Now, it seems that the West is doing everything to prolong this war. Yes, we have stated that our approach is that we would like to engage in talks. But after the first round of talks, when we agreed to the Ukrainian side's proposal to engage in contacts, and when we implemented a ceasefire, we saw that Ukrainians would not reciprocate. And so we decided that during the following rounds we would not have any ceasefires until we have signed agreements. So these provocations that you mentioned are outrageous. As to Bucha, our military has provided both chronological and video analysis arguments, and arguments that deal with, I'm sorry for going in these details, considering the specifics of the dead bodies and how they were positioned and how they looked. So it is unthinkable that grown-up people, diplomats, can make such unjustified statements. If we take Bucha, this has been going on for many days now, but with Kramatorsk, their provocation was met with facts from our side. We provided facts which disproved their allegations, and they fell silent. They didn't have anything to respond. This Saturday and Sunday, our National Defense Management Center provided plans and demonstrated that Ukrainian side is planning provocations using chemical substances and also other provocations with mass atrocities and mass graves. We will need to counter these provocations with facts. And of course, we will need to act with integrity on the ground and to show that those allegations are untrue. And these talks that we're engaging now, we see that the Ukrainian side is often reversing its position. But we have been patient. What can you say about the conditions our diplomats are working in right now? There's an unfriendly atmosphere at the UN and other institutions. Are there any threats to our diplomats? Is there any need for enhanced security? How can we protect the rights of our people abroad when this Russophobia is so rampant? Well, as to diplomats, they work in difficult conditions. We know that terrorist attacks are being carried out against our facilities and compounds. So there are concerns about physical security, but our diplomats have protection due to their status, and we have issued recommendations to avoid going around the city alone, but speaking more broadly about Russians living abroad. They are facing regular attacks, physical attacks. And I know that this is being discussed in Western capitals and in the meetings of Western embassies in Russia. So ambassadors and some of our colleagues, and I don't want to mention any names here, but we've heard that there have been concerns voiced by European diplomats that this Russophobia is throwing a bad light on the image of the European Union. But I would say that it just enhances the image that already exists, because the speed with which this wave of Russophobia spread around Europe is very staggering. So, as one researcher put it, latent racism never left Europe. So, as Hitler promoted anti-Semitism and sentiments against Slavic peoples as well. Now, similarly, we see that any remnants of decorum, of political correctness, is now thrown away. And when Ukrainian politicians, I think it was someone at the level of minister who said that a dead Russian is a good Russian, and only a dead Russian is a good Russian. And the prime minister said that all Russians should be ostracized and discriminated, because we don't have the time to acknowledge whether a person is for or against Putin. So they're saying that openly. And of course, those are very serious things, and we will utilize all available means to protect our citizens. We have a foundation to protect the rights of Russians abroad. We're enhancing its funding. It provides legal aid, enhancing the possibilities of people living abroad to higher laws. So this is indeed a problem, and we'll see into these offenses. Thank you. Thank you for finding time. Thank you.